Let's start with a very interesting Reddit story from RivCA. When service personnel screw the pooch. Here's a story for you. I served from 2009 to 2016 in the US Navy, originally slated as a nuclear machinist's mate. Location names will be used except for private businesses and people who work at the same. But if you're familiar with the area, you should know what's going on. One weekend in November 2009, I was wrapping up my A school, the first school that we had to go through to get qualified as Navy nuclear operators. My classmates and I didn't feel like spending the whole weekend on base studying, so we went off base to the local mall and shopping centre. I was perusing the local tabletop game store, the Dragon's Roost, first name change, and I was intrigued by all the Warhammer 40,000 models on display. Most of it was artfully painted and placed on display for people to see what can be done with the hobby. I came across one diorama with a bunch of space marines duking it out with a squad of tyranids. All the marines had names associated with them, on flags flying for each, with people related to the store on the Space Marine side, US Navy, US Army, or good customer, insert name here. The Space Marines I could recognize as Brother Steve, the store owner, name changed, and Brother Shannon, his wife, name also changed. However, my eye was caught by one Space Marine, bolter pistol a foot away by scale, from his outstretched hand lying on the ground with a clean hole through his chest. His flag read, Brother Shoplifter. There had to be a story behind this. I asked Steve about it, and with it being a slow Saturday, lucky us, he launched into his tale. OP's note, I'll be shifting to his perspective as Steve told me the story. Back in the mid-90s, we were having a bumper day. I was ringing up customers non-stop. We had a bunch of off-duty sailors, airmen and marines playing tabletop games on the side room, and my wife was generally wondering to make sure everyone was satisfied, given the day's chaos. I don't see Shannon stop in the breezeway between the rooms, putting her hands on her hips. One of the marines did. Marine asked, "What's going on, Shannon?" She had started glaring at one kid, a fresh-out-of-boot airman, with a sweatshirt on, going up and down the comic book aisles grabbing stuff and not putting everything back. She simply responded, "I think that man is stealing." All of the players got up from that table and went to cover the doors. 2 flanked Shannon, 1 to the back, 2 to the front, and 1 to either side of the aisle the booty was in. The 2 covering the aisle were both Marines built like a brick outhouse. They approach the kid and ask what he has under his sweater. The kid responds, "Nothing." "Nothing, huh?" An open palm punch flies out and hits the kid square in the chest, his arms flying out to either side of him to maintain balance, and comics drop out of the front of his sweatshirt all over the floor. "Nothing, huh?" Then loudly, "That looks like about $500 worth of stolen goods. Hey, Steve, isn't that grand larceny?" I started reeling a bit, but come to my senses and say, "Yeah, it is." Then the Marines both grab the kid and start hauling him out the front door towards one of the sailors' Camaros to shove him into the back and take him back to base. I figure they had it well in hand. Meanwhile, a shipyard bubba with his son in tow comes in and asks me what's going on. I told him it was a shoplifter and the serviceman had it under control. "Shouldn't you call the cops?" he asks. "Huh, yeah, I should." I step out front and call out to the group, "Hey guys, we have a witness." The Marines, who were having difficulty shoving the airman into the non-existent back seat of this Camaro, pause and look at each other and the sailor, then haul the kid back inside and plop him down between a couple of the display cases and stare the kid down, daring him to make a move while I call Charleston police. Within 10 minutes, a cop black as night and roughly 7 feet tall arrives to take charge. He's so tall, he has to duck under the doorframe to get in. He then asks me if I was the owner or the manager of the establishment. I responded, "I am the owner." The cop takes one look at the kid, now white as a sheet, and asks me, "What do you want me to do to him?" Not with "to." Charleston police will bend over backwards to please owners of any building or establishment they get called to, but don't give a hoot about managers or renters, this being the South. It's a very southern US thing. I just told the cop to take the kid back to whatever base he's from. They'll deal with him there. To my surprise, the cop is back within 20 minutes and told me that the kid was just going to get a slap on the wrist based on the reception he received. I wouldn't have that, so I called up one of my friends on the base, a Chief Master Sergeant, call him Chief, an E9 in the Air Force, and the first sergeant of the base at the time. I gave him the whole spiel, and he told me he will take care of it. We kept tabs through the kid's ordeal, where I found out he was put on extra latrine duties on his side of the runway, and then immediately moved over to the other side of the runway to do more of the same for the landing planes and their lavatories. This had gone on for a good 3 months, when his captain, Air Force 03, took notice and put in immediate transfer papers, seeing as the kid obviously pissed off one of his seniors and was getting hammered for it. As it turned out, all transfer papers crossed the first sergeant's desk for signing off and adjustments, up to and including recommended rerouting. He recommended Nome, Alaska, as the kid's next duty post. OP's note, the Nome base hadn't been in use since the mid-1950s by the Air Force, so I'm pretty sure Steve had that one mixed up with one of the other Alaskan bases, but the point was still valid. He called me to tell me what was up with Brother Shoplifter, and I figured that him getting transferred out would be the end of it. Chief, no way, I'm not done with him yet. After another week, the chief called me and told me what was done. The conversation went roughly like this. Nome's receptionist, Nome Air Force Base. This is Airman, redacted speaking. You're on an unsecured line. How may I help you, sir or ma'am? Chief. Hi, this is Chief Master Sergeant, redacted, First Sergeant at Charleston Air Force Base. I would like to speak with my equivalent there on your base regarding a personnel transfer. Airman, wait one. Chief, sure. 5 minutes later. Hello, this is Technical Sergeant, redacted speaking. We don't have a first here, but I am the ranking enlisted. What's up, Chief? Chief, I have a fresh transfer here going up to Alaska for a change in scenery. You should be seeing his papers come through pretty soon, but I need to talk to you regarding the reasons as to why he's being sent out of rotation. Tech, I have a new airman coming up from your neck of the woods, name of Airman Brother Shoplifter, but nothing stating as to why. Chief, that's him. This isn't someone trying to escape their depender, is it? Chief, no, this is someone who got caught up in a legal issue. The other party declined to pressing charges, so he has no local police record. But I wanted to let you know that he got caught shoplifting at one of our local businesses. A comic store by the name of the Dragon's Roost? Tech, wait a minute, he stole from Steve? Once Steve finished telling us this gem, I and my buddies just started howling with laughter. We immediately took the lesson here to heart, in that the military is a very tight-knit community. The Navy nuclear community even more so, as our instructors had told us. I also bought a set of dice that I still use to this day. The revenge was really exemplary and exception. A small clue led to thief receiving consequences for his actions. It was a perfect revenge showing the power of the military network. The revenge was really cool. The next story is from Fweek in Little. Give my hours away to a new hire? I'll leave you with a store to close yourself, misfiled paperwork, and get you fired. I've been lurking on here for a while and finally wanted to post this. Formatting is going to be messy on mobile. This is a long one, stick around for the juice. This happened a couple months ago at an old employer. I worked at a supermarket in my state throughout high school, and while in college in the United States, making $9 to start and only $10.50 at the end. The store had one store manager, 2 assistant store managers, 1 manager, and assistant manager per department, which there were 9 departments. For 5 years, I worked every position there because who knew what hiring was, right? Understaffing was a regular here. So if a department needed closing and I worked, I had to close it. From stocking to register to manager's duties, everything was game. My biggest acknowledgements were being a bookkeeper. Out terms of the person who keeps track of all the money. Monitor, glorified cashier. Basically wrangle the regular cashiers and divvy up cash drawers to each register. Service desk, cigarettes, lottery, customers, and store opener closer. There were 5 people who knew bookkeeping. 2 other people besides me, and the 2 managers who ran the front end of the store. There were about 5 monitors who all needed to be trained on service desk as well. Every monitor and bookkeeper needed to know how to open the store and close it. For being a supermarket in a town with about 20,000 people, we were severely understaffed. I worked 12 to 16-hour shifts at least once a week because people would call off all the time. Keep all this in mind for later on. Backstory: I started working here at 16 in high school, originally as a stock person. 25-hour work weeks, eventually moved up to 35-plus hour work weeks. Moved up to register, then monitor, then service desk, and finally bookkeeping when I turned 18, now 21. The hours were always good, never had a week drop below 35 hours at least. But it all changed because of some dickhead. At the start of COVID-19, I was working while in college, so all these guidelines had to be followed. Everyone needed their toilet paper and hand sanitizer to keep COVID away. No biggie. On top of the guidelines, we also had been hiring a copious amount of people. This store had a history of training new hires with other people who have been working for maybe a month or so. So, as you could guess, training was a disaster. But since COVID-19 had the store busy all the time, we needed more people. I wanted to train people the right way, because I got sick of doing other people's jobs. In March, we had gotten 4 new hires to train for my position. Now these new hires needed training on the service desk. Easy, let them run it while I watched and helped out the best I could. Easiest way to get people to learn. Most of them needed trained on here because there were 3 of us total at the time who could run it. After training everyone, 1 per shift at a time over 4 weeks, there were 7 people now ready to the world. But everyone who knew how to run the service desk needed training on monitor too. Guess who had to train everyone for another position? After another 4 weeks of everyone got trained. Around this time was the end of May. This is where the juice begins. The juice. Starting in June, we had been starting to lay off the hours since COVID-19 started to slow down. Hours started to get cut from all the register people, from about 20-30 hours a week to 10 hours max. We got overstaffed and people started quitting left and right. Not a big deal because those positions were easy to fill, but that's when my hours started getting cut. At the time, the 1 new hire who started in March, who we'll call Helen, had been getting really good hours. I'm talking about my hours. We had the same problem, college money, car money, the works and all. But then I got scheduled for 16 hours 1 week, and they got scheduled for over 35 hours. Not once since I was 18 did I get less than 35 hours. So I decided to confront the assistant manager who was in charge of scheduling. We'll call him Frank. Me. Hey Frank, I noticed my hours got cut. What's happening? Frank. I know. Everyone's hours are getting cut. I have to make room for everyone, you know. Me. I couldn't help but notice that Helen is getting quite the hours, so you made room for her and no one else? Frank. I was unaware of that. I'll get you some more hours next week. The reset of the week was kind of boring since I was a workaholic. No one called me to cover shifts or anything. The following week, I asked around to see who covered any shifts last week, and it turns out that all the new hires got called first. That kind of pissed me off, but hey, can't do anything about it now. Later that day, I checked my schedule, and what do you know? The same 16-hour week. I was livid at this point. I should have been honoured for my seniority there, not getting hours. I went back to Frank and confronted him. Me? Hey, what the hell is this? I thought you'd be finding me hours this week. I can't live off of this. Frank. Well, it turns out that I couldn't find you hours. I tried calling. Me. Tried calling me. Not a single person called me. Instead, all the new hires got called. What the hell, man? Frank. There's nothing I can do. You might have to just find another job. This pissed me off beyond belief. I was ready to pop. But this is when my bright idea came into play. For a couple days, I searched around for other supermarkets in my area offering jobs. After about a day of searching, I found a job paying double what I made now for the same qualifications. I gave them a ring and got an interview for the following week. The following day, I went into work, for what I didn't know was my last shift, and told Frank what was happening. Me. Hey Frank, I just wanted to let you know I took your advice. Frank. Advice? Do you mean finding another job? Me. You're right, I hope you have fun. I will never forget the look on his face. Completely baffled. He didn't expect me to actually find another job so quickly. This is where my revenge began. Revenge? After I walked out of Dickhead Frank's office, I went around doing my usual work. During every shift, paperwork needed to be processed in the computer in order to close the store correctly and set up bookkeeping for the next day. Fun fact, that day in particular was Snap Day. For those who don't know what that is, it's the day that government-funded food stamps arrive on everyone's EBT card, monthly. That day I decided to paperwork and just don't do it. I was quitting that day because my anger got the better of me. The store closes at about 12 a.m. and I walked out of that hole as free as can be. The next day, I woke up to find some really obnoxious and angry texts from co-workers. I completely disregarded them, unknowingly that they said I worked that morning. I went down to the supermarket to grab some things for my house, and as soon as I walked in the door, every ex-co-worker of mine looked at me as if I had just passed on the floor. One of them pulled me aside, let's call them George, and this happened. George: What the bro? I had to cover your shift this morning and you have the balls to walk in here after that? Me: I don't work here anymore. I continued to get my groceries and talked to one of my closer ex-co-workers there about what happened. As it turned out, the Frank had no idea that the previous day was my last and that the entire front end of the store had gotten brutally. Since the store closed at 12 a.m. and no paperwork was filed, our corporate called the assistant manager, also in charge of making sure all departments are closed correctly, and asked where all the paperwork was. No idea that I had not filed it, Frank had to go into the store, over an hour away from him, to file all the paperwork himself. Not only that, tons of violations were given to him because, since none of the paperwork got done by the person closing, no one had a record of anything done at the store from the previous day. On top of everything, the amount of paperwork needed done was practically doubled since that day was Snap. As soon as the store manager heard about this, she was livid. After about a month, I was working my new job and heard some information about Frank. Apparently, he had to go into a meeting with our corporate bosses and the store manager. He had gotten fired from his position due to all of this and had not been able to get a letter of recommendation from that employer also. Sucks to suck, huh? TLDR, manager gives my hours away to new hire and tells me to get another job. I walked out and got him a bunch of violations and fired due to his stupid remarks. The revenge was perfect and executed strategically. Arrogant people like Frank deserve the same consequences for treating people working under them poorly. It is satisfying to see Frank losing his job. The revenge was really cool. The next story is from Kibufox. Don't fire the guy who holds the patents. This is not my story. I was present for it, sure, but I did not see all of it personally. Rather, this is my father's story. So, some context. My father had a degree in mechanical engineering, either a master's or doctorate. It had taken him years to get, and he was very proud of that. Thanks to his training, he had found his way working for many well-known companies, working primarily with the procedures used to make various things. Over time, he'd privately began working on an idea that would revolutionize how school and gym lockers worked. See, my father realized that there was a problem with those type of metal lockers. Namely, it was very easy for a person to break into them. What's more, as the lockers were designed, there were multiple exposed moving parts, which meant that if a student put too many books in one, or really anything got against the door, the locker could be jammed shut, making it near on impossible to open. So, for several years, Dad toyed with a number of ideas before hitting on a new design which would solve all those problems. The inner workings of the locker's locking mechanism would be contained within the door in such a way that 1. It was impossible for someone to shim or break into, 2. The entire mechanism would be enclosed, and 3. it was relatively maintenance-free. Now, at this point, my father was the vice president of manufacturing, and apparently there wasn't a clause in his contract that said that if he designed anything while working for the company, then he had to turn that over to them for profit. Dad still approached the company, offering them the design, but they weren't interested. Dad sat on the design for a while before eventually just taking out several patents on them, and then forgetting about them. About 6 months after his first attempt at getting the company interested, the parent company's owner, chairman of the board, passed away, and the board opted to sell off some of the holdings. The company my dad worked for was part of that. The new owners were young guys who seemed to think they knew everything, as young business owners always seem to think, and they set about changing 99% of the way things were being done. At some point, they stumbled across the plans my father had designed. Now that's where things turned curious. They really wanted to start producing this new design, but as they didn't have all the plans and processes laid out for them, they had to turn to my father for answers. Rather than asking him how to do it, or licensing the patents, as any reputable company would have done, they ordered him to turn over all his work, or else they would fire him. Dad stood his ground and refused. The new owners and my father went back and forth, arguing over details for several weeks, before finally the new owners fired my father for insubordination. So, on to the revenge. There may be more to this, but I'm not entirely sure if it is just pro-revenge. It could border on nuclear, based on what happened some years later, though I'm not certain that what later happened had anything to do with my father's actions. So, after cleaning out his office and packing things in the trunk of his car, my father headed home and made a few phone calls. He must have gone through 8 or 9 different calls before he got in touch with someone who was interested in what he had to say. See, my dad was under no illusions that the company that had fired him wasn't going to just make those patented lockers on their own. He also knew that though the company itself was relatively small, the owners had money, and there was no way he could fight them. However, a larger company could. So he contacted the major competitors and made them an offer. He eventually set up a meeting with some people, wheeled out the prototype he'd made, explained how everything worked, and noted that with this system, the company could revolutionize the way lockers were both designed and improve both safety and security. What's more, as he was the only patent holder, for the next 7 years or so, that company could be the only company to produce them. The competitor jumped at the chance and bought all patents both for the design and the process. They even paid my dad a substantial consultancy fee to go out to their manufacturing site and teach their crews how to make the needed tool and die sets to produce them. Less than 6 months after the first company had fired him, their number one competitor was completely destroying them in the market with this new design. And there wasn't a damn thing the first company could do about it. They did try suing my father, claiming he had stolen their intellectual property. But that case quickly evaporated when they had to admit under oath that they'd never actually signed a contract with him. And there was no requirement that he turn over anything he created to the company. In the 7 years from when the second company bought the locker design and process patents, they pretty handily moved into markets that previously they'd been unable to. The first company soldiered on, but by the time the patent had finally expired, they were a shadow of their former selves. The new owners had sold the company at a loss, with the competitor buying it, only to shut that production facility down due to redundancy. Put maybe 200 people out of work, though given how they'd lost so much business, I wager that it was far less than that. So yeah, the new guys don't want to play ball, threaten the guy that holds the patents on something they want to do, and then fire him, only to have him take everything to their competitor and effectively put them out of business. Edit. To answer some of the questions that have arose. 1. You don't know what his degree level was? My father and I had a difficult relationship. There are very few good memories I have of him, and it wasn't until shortly before his death in 2007 from a stroke that I really started to connect with him. I resented him for most all of my life because he was more career-minded than anything. I figure we moved some 10 times in 20 years, and it greatly affected me. For a rather long period of time, I am ashamed to say I hated my father and wanted nothing to do with him. 2. You must have ended up wealthy. Not really. Any money that Dad earned off his little endeavour was lost after an incident that left him disabled. Medical bills being what they are, by the end of it we were pretty much broke. 3. Patents last 20 years. Design patents don't. They last 14, but the courts have historically sided with companies infringing on design patents after 7 years, so long as the infringing company develops their own method to produce whatever design is being used and modifies or changes it. 4. What company was this? You know I can't tell you that. 5. Any variation of, how did the new owners not know? That answer is pure speculation on my part. However, I got the impression that the owners were in their mid to late 20s and trying to act like investors. The company was on offer relatively cheap, from what I know, but had a rather long history in the manufacturing field. The revenge was brutal and, of course, destroying. Ego of the company owner cost him millions for years, and finally he had to sell his company at loss. It is one of the best reminders that never trick with employees. They can become very dangerous.